Lee Bortons, and I host conversations with interesting people and hope you are interested in it. Our goal is to seek to explore opportunities open to young men and women beyond traditional college route, all from a Christ-centered perspective. So welcome to Daniel, who is from Hillsdale College, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Amanda Kleist, and Lee Bortons is also the co-host here.
Great, it's
Thanks,
my pleasure
Amanda.
to be with you.
Thank you for being here, Daniel. I'm really excited about this conversation. I want to give you just a brief intro for our audience and tell them the purpose why we invited you. Markers and Milestones, of course, is trying to get the word out that people don't have to go to college, but Amanda and I love the idea of college. We love hanging out with colleagues who are intellectuals and academics and want to study all kinds of things. So you would be here representing the classical model, which we love, of course, and Hillsdale, which is a very popular college with homeschoolers and in particular classical conversation students. And so I just wanted to have some time to hear about your master's program now that you have in classical arts, as well as I have some questions about some of the courses that you've taught in the past. Your bio is very interesting. So before I explain that, why don't you just tell us who you are with your family and your professional background? Just give us a brief bio.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I've heard of your work for quite some time, and it's a real pleasure to join both of you today. I grew up in a Christian home. I'm an MK, which is not a military kid. I'm a missionary kid. So I moved around quite a bit when I was growing up. My parents were dedicated to Christian service, and so that was part of our home all along. They did their best, to provide a quality education for me. I went to public school for a short period of time, but I spent most of my time in Christian school, and my mother actually homeschooled me when I was in the second grade for a short period of time. So I've had a wide variety of experiences. Went to Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia for my undergrad, and I got a degree in Spanish, but more importantly, I met my wife there, who is a registered nurse, and she has ever since our children were born, she's worked part-time, and now she is the college nurse at Hillsdale College. So upon graduation, I taught in a traditional public school for 5 years, and my experience with the students was quite enjoyable, but I felt very, very frustrated as well. I decided to go into higher education, and so I went to Michigan State, graduated with a PhD in education, and started working in a research state university, and experienced the same kind of frustration I felt as a public school teacher, and was offered a job in 2006 to join the faculty of Hillsdale College, and I've been there ever since. I started as an assistant professor in education, and have kind of worked my way along, and I'm now a professor of education, and I also serve as the dean, as you mentioned, for our brand new graduate school of classical education at Hillsdale College.
That's great. So generally what happens is I ask the logistical questions, and Amanda asks the really thoughtful questions.
Okay.
So that gives her a chance to just listen to what we're talking about and really be a little more probing, because we're trying to just really point out Christian education. So two things you said, of course, interest us. The secular experience at the public school, K-12, and the public university. Why don't you explain what the frustration you had was? I guess that's what drove you towards Christian education.
Yeah, that's right. As I said, my own experience, I spent the majority of my time in a Christian context, either homeschool or Christian school. I did graduate from a public high school for 1 year, and then at Liberty, I was once again in that Christian environment where it was an honorable thing and a good and a right thing to talk about the Lord and His working in our lives, but I had this desire to return to public education and try to do some good. And I really hope that I did. In the 5 years that I taught at the high school where I taught, hope that I did. I hope I was able to reach students and to help them in their education. But I also felt a frustration, and there's a frustration, there's the obvious frustration involved in public education in that you're not able to speak about your faith in a very in an overt way. You're not allowed to address those things that you care about deeply. And that's the most obvious thing, but there's also an undercurrent as well in a traditional public education that views the human being as a very different creature. This is a little bit of a generalization, but I think it's absolutely true that the public system often treats students either in two very different ways. One is that they take this kind of noble child approach, where the child is completely formed already, and it's the teacher's job to kind of clear away society and all the corrupting forces. So there's that kind of noble child approach to education, where education is a self-actualization, right? So just allowing the child to be who the child thinks he or she is. The other strand, I would say, of traditional public education is this, what we would call in the liberal arts context, more of a servile approach to education, where education is always leading towards the next thing, which is often get an education, get a job so that you can earn money. And so there's this kind of technical aspect to education that, again, I would say it is not in line with a more liberal approach to education, liberal arts approach to education, where education is about human formation. And so I felt that frustration as a public school teacher. I felt it in the context of a public university, a state university as well, where my students were viewed as either these ideal, noble people, already complete. What was I there for? Or this kind of a servile approach of just getting them ready for the world of work. And that was frustrating to me, because I think my parents had done a very good job of preparing me and providing me with a quality education. And they certainly viewed education to be more than just job preparation. They viewed my own education to be the cultivation of who I am, who God created me to be. And so I just felt that pull when I was in a more public school or traditional state university, pulling away from that tendency that my parents had worked so hard to cultivate in me as a human being, and eventually as an educator as well.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you've kind of answered my next question for you, was could you explain what's the difference to you with a Christian classical education then in comparison to what you just described? And in fact, classical education is defined a lot of different ways. So how do you view it?
Right. Yes. I was curious about that, especially with the human formation comment.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So as a Christian, I believe that we've been created in the image of God, and that God has a plan for our lives. And I think that He has ordered the world, ordered the universe, ordered reality in a way for us to know Him and to enjoy Him forever. And so education should be pointed in that direction. And so a Christian classical education should be cultivating an understanding as much as we can, as God has revealed to us, should be cultivating that understanding of God, of reality, of our role that God has defined for us in reality, in the world. And so a classical Christian education is, I think, correctly responding to that reality and how God has formed the world and created the world, and wants us to be part of His plan. And so I think a classical Christian education is consistent with that.
So do you have any questions, Amanda, before I jump into my questions about his master's?
Well, actually, I do, because it's kind of a corollary. She's going to ask you about the master's,
Sure.
and you have a very high view, I would say, of what it takes to be classically Christian. Does the master's reflect that you're the dean of?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
And
Let
how
me
does it do it?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm happy. Let me try to answer your question in a unique way. Prior to us opening up a graduate program, I've been teaching undergraduates, since 2001. So I've been teaching undergraduates for a long time. I've been at Hillsdale, since 2006, and so we have a number of students who graduate from Hillsdale. Actually, a little bit of a sidetrack. We don't have a certification program. We got rid of our state-approved teacher preparation program in 2008, and so we are trying to shape students to be educators, to be quality human beings. So, in our view of what education should be, we have taken the approach that the best teachers are those who are well ordered themselves. And so rather than taking an approach to education of preparing students to be technicians in the classroom, we're much more interested in who the person is than what they can actually do in terms of teaching. We believe that teaching involves a craft, there's skill involved, there's knowledge involved, but that's the easier work. The harder work is actually the formation of the soul. And we think that the best teachers, the ones who will be able to shape the lives of their students, should be well ordered and shaped and cultivated themselves. So you ask about our graduate program. One of the most common questions that I got teaching undergraduates is they would leave Hillsdale College, they would go and they would teach. And after a few years, they would say, I want to continue my education. I love this thing called education. What should I get my master's in? And so I would say, well, you kind of have two choices. If, let's say you're an upper school history teacher or an upper school biology teacher, you could choose to get a master's degree in the particular field. Or you can get a degree in the field of education. Unfortunately, the latter option there, often what our students would experience were actually contrary to what they were learning while they were undergraduates at Hillsdale. So to answer your question, the program at Hillsdale is an effort to not make the mistake that many education programs have made, which is that they are philosophically orientated in the wrong direction. They take that servile approach to education. But our master's program starts with the idea, again, that our teachers are going to be most effective if they're well ordered. So our master's program is a 2-year program. It's a residential program. I can talk a little bit about the details now or later. Okay.
No, tell us about it.
Yeah, it's a 2-year residential program. It is thanks to the donation of our generous donors, it is a completely tuition-free program. And so our students can come and complete the 2 years of the master's program completely tuition-free. We offer courses in the fall, spring. We take the summer off, and then we offer courses in the fall and the spring again. So it's 2 years. Now, to your question, Amanda, let me explain. The first year of the program has 3 strands across it. It is a history strand, a philosophy strand, and a humane letters strand. And the effort there is to say, we're going to take these disciplines of history, philosophy, and humane letters, and we're going to triangulate. We're going to look through these 3 different lenses at the same thing called education. And so we have our students complete kind of a chronological approach of all 3 of those disciplines, specifically looking at the field of education. So we only admit students in the fall, and they come in as a cohort together of anywhere from 10 to 20 students. They take all of their courses, history, philosophy, humane letters, across that first year as a cohort. In the second year of the program, we allow students to differentiate their programs a little bit. The only required class that we have is we have a class called Classical Pedagogy and Curriculum, which asks our students to take those ideas of philosophy, history, humane letters, and now look at a K-12 context. In light of what we understand about human nature, in light of what we understand about what education is, what should an upper school mathematics class look like? What should a middle school history class look like? And it's a practical approach, or it's an effort to get our students to apply those ideas that they've learned in the first year. And then in that second year, we also we have a number of people who have come to us who want to go into school administration. So we have education leadership classes, we have school administration classes, which are the education of the leadership class is much more about the principles of good leadership. And going to your question again, in teaching those principles of leadership, we look at history and literature. What can we learn from George Washington? What can we learn, from King Lear? What can we learn, from these bad examples, these good examples about what it means to be a good leader? And then our school administration class is much more focused on the nuts and bolts of running a school. What does a faculty manual look like? How do you read a budget? These kind of practical things. And then in that second year, for people who are not interested in administration, we have a wide variety of special topics classes. So in the coming year, we have a class specifically on Plato in education. Now in that first year, they get plenty of Plato, but this is an opportunity for our students to take a deep dive into the works of Plato and answer those fundamental questions about what does it mean to be educated. We also have a class on T.S. Eliot, where our students can take a deep dive on T.S. Eliot and probe questions about education. In the spring, we have a class on a C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. That's the same kind of a thing. What can we learn from these educators in their writing, both their fiction and their nonfiction, about what it means to be educated? So you can see the first year is much more of a core experience where the students are experiencing and they're getting a good foundation. They're being shaped and formed as educators. And then in the second year, we allow that room for students to pursue ideas and classes which interest them. I hope I've answered your question.
You did. And
Okay.
you also stirred more questions, which is a good
Great.
part of classical education, is we
Sure.
always should have a few more questions. So our audience is going to need some definition about how history, philosophy, and humane letters results in a Christian worldview. Because right now, all I hear is classics. So far, I do not hear Christian in what you've said in the way my audience will understand it. So give me some definitions, help me see it, or be transparent and say, hey, you go to your local church for that. Which one are you doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I appreciate the probing. I really do. And yes, let's define terms here. So when we talk about classical education, what we're talking about is not exclusively, but it suggests the idea of an education in the Western tradition.
Okay.
So the first thing I will say in terms of your question about Christian, I'll give a more broad view, and then I want to address it specifically in terms of Hillsdale, because I think it goes to the identity of who Hillsdale is and what we actually do. So a Christian classical education is an education in Western culture. Now, going back to antiquity, you're not going to see a lot of Christian elements in there when we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, at least prior to Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about a liberal education, oftentimes you talk about Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem. So, that is absolutely part of it. The Old Testament is part of that. So in terms of a classical education, whether it's Christian or it's not Christian, Christianity is woven throughout it. In the last, 2 millennia in particular, it's woven throughout. And to not address it and to not highlight it is to betray the Western tradition because it's woven so tightly within that tradition. So that's kind of the broad understanding. Our students, when they read history, when they read philosophy, when they read humane letters, they're going to be reading people who honored that Christian tradition in varying degrees, and those who actually promoted ideas that were contrary to that Christian tradition and rejected that Christian tradition. So we don't have a policy of only read Christians, which I don't think that you would argue for either.
No, that's not what we're arguing for. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, so that's kind of the broad understanding of what the program is. Any classical education is going to have Christianity woven throughout it. Now, I often get this question about Hillsdale College in particular. It identifies itself as a Christian college, a Christian liberal arts college. It does that in a way similar that I think that C.S. Lewis is describing Christianity in Mere Christianity. In other words, if you'll recall, if you've read that, at the beginning of the book, he talks about the hallway in which those who hold a Christian worldview can congregate and come together and agree. But then there are also the rooms as well that go off of that hallway. And I think that Hillsdale College identifies itself as a Christian college in that way. Now, I hesitate to speak for the entire college. I am the dean of one program, within the college. So
Sure.
I would strongly encourage, listeners and viewers to look at the website, look at our college catalog where all of this is spelled out. That said, I can speak as one who has been a part of the community for quite some time. The faculty, overwhelming majority, identify themselves as Christian. Now, within that definition, you will find people who will adhere to a Protestant tradition, others who will adhere to a Catholic and even Orthodox tradition, and there are probably some who would say they're somewhere in between, and they don't really define themselves and explicitly within those traditions. I would suggest that the student body is also within that realm as well, where the overwhelming majority of the students would identify themselves as Christian. And then we have students who are Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and other in terms of how they identify or the religious tradition that they adhere to, you might say. So
Thank you.
yeah. So
Hey, we only got a few minutes. I got to stop you, Amanda, because we only have a few minutes. And there's one thing you have to tell us about, Daniel.
sure.
You in your bio said that you have a course that you've taught in the past on pirates. It's one of my favorite topics. So I want to know, what kind of things were you teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at Hillsdale College, I primarily teach courses on English grammar. I love to diagram sentences, and it's I thank my middle school teacher, Mrs. Tiarks, for instilling that love of diagramming. I just think in diagrams now. In fact, when I'm in church and we're reading a verse or something like that, I'll often turn over the bulletin and I'll begin to diagram the verse right there in church. I can't help but diagram. So I teach English grammar. I teach pedagogy, so how to teach. And then I also teach classic children's literature, and I teach that every year, and I love it. In fact, the college has actually put out an online course, based on my class. But we also get to teach these elective classes, these one credit electives. And so I've taught this class a couple of times it's called Pirates with an exclamation mark. So that kind of gives you an idea about the nature of the class. It actually has a subtitle. I called it Pirates, the Romance and Reality of Piracy. And so what I did in the class was we would actually learn about pirates, especially during the golden age of piracy, Edward Teach and Blackbeard and all of that. But we would talk about Captain Phillips, in the Somali pirates around Africa and all of that. So we would talk about pirates in generally. We would also talk about things like online piracy as well. And then that's kind of the reality of piracy. But then I would also do the romance of a piracy as well. So we did the Pirates of Penzance. We would do an opera. We would do short stories. I would talk about Treasure Island, which is a great love of mine, and all of these fictional pirates as well. And so it's kind of a comment or a combination of the romance and the reality of piracy. And I absolutely adore the class.
So I live in
I'm sorry, we lost her.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
There you.
okay. I live in North Carolina and Amanda's in
Mm.
California, and North Carolina is where Blackbeard was. And so
That's right.
yeah, and then so every year we do a pirate adventure and do piratey things together as a family. So I also appreciate you just probably gave the best explanation of classical education that you've done this evening, because you could integrate so many different things and find the joy in them and make those connections. And I think that's what is the hallmark of a classical education. Is that you can think clearly, and of a Christian education is you can think clearly about reality and the way the Lord really. So pirates are a good way to go. Amanda, I'm going to finish the conversation, going to keep it out,
Okay.
and then I'll be back if I get back again. Amanda and I have another conversation at 7:30. So,
All right.
but I'll try to hang in.
All right. So Daniel, you identified as an MK. Where were you?
Well, my parents were actually primarily stateside. My dad was a Canadian, so we lived in Canada, and then we lived in the States for a while. But when we did move overseas, we actually lived in Panama. I lived there for 4 years, and then I came back to the States and I graduated from high school. But my parents actually lived there for 10 years. So I know Panama very well. I was telling my girls the other day, I actually water skied in the Panama Canal, not in the locks themselves, but I actually water skied in the Panama Canal in Lake Gatun, which is in Panama there. So, well,
I'm really appreciative of all the time you've spent with us on Markers and Milestones, and it is a milestone to get a master's degree in education. One quick question here. Do you take people who don't come out of education to get this master's if they're looking to transition their fields?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, so the majority of people who come to us do not have a degree in education. They typically have an undergraduate degree in something other than education. And then we also don't require teaching experience, although we do recommend it. Now, teaching experience can be in a classroom. It can be teaching your own children. It could be teaching in a Sunday school context. So we recommend just because we think that our students will get more out of it. One more thing I wanted to add, Amanda, if you don't mind, is that we are opening up what we're calling a hybrid program a year from now, actually June 2024. And this is specifically designed for people who can't uproot their lives and move to Hillsdale for 2 years. And it offers the same program, one class at a time, rather than students completing it in 2 years. Our students will complete it in 3 years. So this is specifically targeted towards people who again can't come to Hillsdale. We anticipate having a number of homeschool parents, homeschool educators come and actually participate in that master's program. So stay tuned for that.
Well, I appreciate your time tonight. And Lee, you hung in there to the end of this. And I didn't say at the beginning, but today and tonight is July 31st. It's the last day of the month of July in 2023. And Daniel, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. And we appreciate this. And we hope you have a great rest of your summer if you have any left. You have a great evening. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle.
Bye.
Bye.